I want to start with the title of your book, obviously, The End of the End of History. It's also a phrase that I think you guys talk about on your podcast quite a fair bit. And it's, of course, a reference to Francis Fukuyama's famous declaration after the fall of the Berlin Wall that the world was witnessing the end of history. And I want to look at that phrase because you talk about it in your book and you point out that this phrase is actually pretty widely misunderstood. Fukuyama was not saying that, like, all time had stopped or we could never talk about history again, but he was referring to something pretty specific. So I was wondering if you could lay out what he meant by that, and then by extension, why are we now witnessing the end of history?
Right, yeah. So I mean, history obviously doesn't just need to be understood as events, right? That's like, I guess, lowercase history with a lowercase h. Uppercase history means something more fundamental in the way that means humans consciously shaping their society, consciously shaping the future, constantly shaping history, right? And what's happened, I mean, at the end of history, Francis Fukuyama's contestation basically was that you no longer have any systemic alternatives to capitalism, right? With the defeat and the crumbling of the Soviet Union and really existing socialism. And the defeat, also the historic defeat of the working class as a systemic alternative in the West as well. So what you have is a situation in which there's no longer any systemic alternatives, and liberal democracy is taken to be the final form of human government, in the words that he uses. Now, what does that mean? That means that you'll have things happening, especially in less orderly parts of the world, like in the global South. You'll have events, you'll have riots, you'll have coups, you'll still have events, but there won't be any sense that any of those events really challenge the way that society is ordered or the sense of default of the end of history. And that sense of default is something that I grew up with. I think most people who would have grown up or come of age before the global financial crisis will have known, will have been conscious of, and probably even longer than just 2008, probably until at least 2016, there was this sense that nothing could really change. We didn't really believe it, however much we talked about change. In fact, even elites talked a lot about change. I remember like Tony Blair constantly talking about change, and we have to adapt to change. But change was something you had to adapt to, not something that you would carry out consciously as an organized movement.
And can you talk about, how did politics change, like within countries after the fall of the Soviet Union, meaning the scope of politics? So even in major countries like the United States or Brazil, like how does the scope kind of change after there is no longer the Soviet Union and maybe that kind of aspiration?
Yeah, I mean, already towards the latter days of the Soviet Union, there probably wasn't so much of a sense that there could be revolution across the world. I mean, revolution was maybe by that point relegated to something that might happen in the third world, what was called then the third world. But I'm not sure how much belief there still was. But I think the very existence of the Soviet Union still gave a sense that there exists an alternative that you could point to. By that point, it was so decrepit that you might not want to point to it. Many socialists no longer wanted to, certainly after 1956 and the invasion of Hungary. But the point still remained that there was a sense that there could be a different horizon to capitalism. That capitalism wasn't all that there was. Maybe it was limited in the sense that the Soviet Union was an alternative, but it didn't seem to be a higher stage of history by that point anymore. But nevertheless, it was an alternative. And that reduced the scope domestically as well, because the existence of active labor unions, of a working class movement which was combative, which if wasn't necessarily fighting for revolution, it was at least fighting for gains within capitalism, for concessions from the capitalist class. Once that was gone, you no longer had the disciplining effect on elites that those movements used to carry out. And as a consequence, elites became, on one level, in international politics, incredibly hubristic, because they felt that they could just bomb their way to changing the world in their image, right? So the invasion of Iraq, of course, being the most obvious example of that. But not just that. Domestically, what happened was that you had a foreclosure of political contestation, which is the way that we put it, which is a way that basically a strategy of depoliticization, so that important matters of politics were taken out of the realm of political contestation. And the clearest example, I mean, you guys were just talking about neoliberalism right before I came on. And the classic example there is central bank independence. something which should be a public matter, should be publicly debated, should be something which is the product of, the setting of interest rates should be the product of political contestation, and instead of something which is removed, put in the hands of technocrats, put in the hands of specialists, so that politicians can no longer interfere.
So to jump forward a little bit to the end of history, in your book, you kind of identify the 2008 financial crash as a turning point. And actually, post-crash, I think a lot of commentators sort of rushed to declare that neoliberalism was dead or dying. And I want to talk about this phrase, the end of history, again, because that's different from history restarting, right? Like, you make that point in your book. Yeah. So what can you tell us, or what does the financial crash in 2008 kind of signify? And what did we see after that sort of marks the beginning of some kind of rupture?
Right. So two things. Firstly, I'll talk about how the end of history ended, and then I'll talk about what the determinant factors of the end of history were, so that we can evaluate whether the end of history really has ended, right? So the first thing is that the global financial crisis obviously was a very profound event, but the amazing thing was that the political manifestations of it, the political consequences of it, were really delayed. I remember when it happened and thinking, wow, now everything's going to change. And it was amazing how things didn't. In fact, it became worse. You had a deepening of neoliberal rule through austerity policies. And then it was not until around maybe 2011 with the Arab Spring, which was suddenly brought the idea of revolution, the notion of revolution, back into kind of global public consciousness. And then you had the movements of the squares in Spain and Greece. And so little by little, you start getting growing protests, growing riots, uprisings, and so on around the world. And it seems like the political establishments in various different countries, in many different countries, starts withering. Its authority starts slipping away. And then where we date the end of history from really is 2016, because there at the very core of global capitalism, you have a politician elected in Trump who no longer follows the nostrums of the age of the end of history, of globalization, of post-politics. For all that Trump was clownish, he actually in some ways repoliticized politics, because he brought contestation, dissensus back on the scene, right? He said things that weren't meant to be said. And there was a whole effort at deglobalization. And then Brexit in a very different way. I mean, I don't think Trump and Brexit are at all the same, and we discuss why in the book. But Brexit as well is a break with the idea of ever closer union of the European Union, continual European integration. It seemed to be a move again towards deglobalization, potentially even a break with neoliberalism. And so those are quite fundamental. And so, I mean, when we started thinking about these things, it was really around 2016, early 2017, where we were like, wow, things have really changed. We grow up really frustrated with the fact that there was no politics, and that all political kind of ventures on the left seem to really come to nothing, have no traction, and be really mostly kind of individualistic and carnivalesque. And you can think of sort of the anti-globalization movement as an example. Suddenly, as of 2016, there seemed to be real traction. There was Bernie, there was Corbyn, and so on the left. And although they didn't really point to a world beyond capitalism, they at least pointed to a world possibly beyond neoliberalism.
But I guess to follow up on that, at the same time, even though we see kind of this break with the neoliberal consensus in 2016, as you've been saying, something that you talk about in your book is the resurgence of anti-politics. And I was wondering if you could tease that out a little bit, because when we see a figure like Trump kind of rising, or we see the movement of the squares, in the early 2010s, or even the kinds of protests and politics that the left seems to be engaging in now. Is this politics proper? I want you to tease that out, because I thought that was a really interesting part of your book.
Right. And so the way we put it in kind of the most schematic, basic form, but I think it's a good kind of thing to hold on to as sort of a handrail to understand these changes, is a shift from post-politics to anti-politics. And now post-politics was the dominant form of government throughout the end of history period. It's, as I've already described, it's the foreclosure of political contestation, right? Important realms of policy are moved, even at a kind of discursive, ideological level. The whole discourse is like, we can't do that. No, you have to, curtail your demands. That's not possible because the rules of globalization say it isn't, right? So if you wanted to pursue an industrial policy or have subsidies for key industries, the government to guarantee jobs, all of these things are off the table. No, sorry, can't be done, right? These are the rules. And also an emphasis on consensus, right? Anybody who would discursively break with that idea of consensus was told to shut up, like to basically that's not allowed, or even, criticized as being racist, as being sexist or whatever, right? You can even see it with the kind of, the Bernie bro thing of being called sexist and so on. It's just a way of delegitimizing anybody who contests the sort of neoliberal managerial order. And whether we agree with the way that those challengers did their politics, right? If you think about like right-wing populists, you might not agree with them, but in some ways they were challenging post-politics. But they challenged post-politics with anti-politics. So they didn't mobilize in defense of an idea, whether it be socialism or even sort of maybe some libertarianism or some other idea that we haven't even thought of, right? That wasn't what happened. Instead, it was a denunciation of the political class as a whole and possibly the whole establishment. Maybe even in a deeper sense, a denunciation of representation itself, right? So when people on the street say they don't represent us, it's not saying, but we wish to take power and elect our own representatives or directly seize power. It was always like these guys up there, get rid of all of them, but there was no sense of anything else being put in its place. So it's just a complete rejection. And although that seems really radical, and I think is an important first step, and that's what we say in the book, that the growth of anti-politics and anti-politics is challenge to post-politics brings politics back in. So that's a lot of, I've said politics way too many times probably there. But the point being that politics at its very core is contestation, is dissensus. And when you have a managerial consensus, you do not have politics. Politics isn't just government, isn't just the administration of day-to-day affairs of the state. It's about different visions, different competing visions over the social order. And so anti-politics arises, but it kind of ends up being a bit self-defeating. And we use the example of Brazil. That's obviously something that I'm really familiar with, where you have a very classic almost example of how anti-politics ends up being really self-defeating, because you have this big uprising. If people aren't familiar with the history, I mean, I've written about it for Jacobin, in 2013, where you have this big mass movement, millions and millions of people on the streets demanding better rights, better education, healthcare, and so on, an end to corruption, which seems really radical and seems to break with a certain consensus politics. Even though it was the Workers' Party in government, there was still a form of neoliberal consensus politics operating, which then transforms into an anti-corruption movement, which really leads Bolsonaro to power eventually, because you have such a delegitimation of the political class, but nothing else proposed to take its place, that you end up with a political vacuum. All of the old establishment parties see their authority completely withered. They lose their electoral bases, and instead it creates space for political entrepreneurs. This was a script which in some ways perfectly encapsulates what we're talking about. But there was an earlier instance of this, which is Italy, which maybe we'll come to talk to, because of course, Berlusconi features even on the cover of the book. So I'm sure you'd be interested to hear about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, actually, maybe to follow up on that, because I think that is an interesting part of the book about how anti-corruption politics can be very bad for the left. And I think, that might seem counterintuitive, like what's wrong with being against corruption? Of course, we're against it. Can you maybe say more about that and maybe go into Italy? Like how is anti-corruption not necessarily the best frame we want to use?
Yeah, I mean, so the problem with anti-corruption is, obviously at a base level, it doesn't carry with it any specific politics, any specific claims or vision about how society should be. And in fact, since the end of the Cold War, I mean, before the end of the Cold War, anti-corruption politics were always associated more with the left, with national liberation movements, with anti-colonial movements, with the socialist, with working class movement, and so on. But that was always carried alongside a vision of politics. So if it was a national liberation movement, it was, the old colonial elites are completely corrupt. They don't allow us to develop, and we want to take charge and run society, run our nation for ourselves. After the end of the Cold War, it changes, and anti-corruption becomes called transparency, and there's a big NGO called Transparency International, which does these rankings of who are the most corrupt countries and who are the least. But it's just based on surveys, perceptions. It's actually a kind of neoliberal form of politics, because what transparency rather than anti-corruption does is it says that governments need to be fully transparent so that states can't rent seek against international capital. So rather than being free of corruption, what they actually propose is that international capital be free. And so it's been wielded as an arm of the State Department. I saw Samantha Power has been talking about anti-corruption recently, and so, the Biden administration. So there's obviously an instrumentalization of anti-corruption there to sort of neoliberal ends, I guess. But as it works as a sort of popular demand, an anti-corruption demand, and you see anti-corruption protests emerging all over the world. At the end of 2019, you had in Lebanon, in Iraq, and you had all over Eastern Europe, and so on. But the problem with it is that it ends up delegitimating politicians, and not just those politicians who we want to get rid of, but maybe the practice of politics as a whole, because it suggests that political autonomy, basically the ability to make choices, to, for example, pursue state-led development so that the state, maybe a state bank, invests in national industries, protects jobs, and so on. That sort of politics will be prey to corruption, because if you give politicians money to spend, they're going to disperse it in ways, there's going to be pork barrel spending. They're going to waste the money. They're going to pocket the money themselves, right? And so anti-corruption ends up putting into question the very notion of political autonomy by the legislature, by the executive, and so on, whatever form that takes, right? And so in that regard, it can be self-defeating, because it's a form of anti-politics in the sense that it puts into question the ability to even do politics, right? Not just the establishment politics that are there, but any sort of alternative politics.
So, sorry, Paul. Go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up and say, I think that's a really important point, because this has come up, even with the first COVID stimulus bill in the United States. Like, part of the Trump talking point was like, well, we can't give it to these blue states governments. They're going to misspend it. And this has happened a frustratingly high amount of times lately, where if I'm talking about funding public ed in the state of Pennsylvania, where the talking point is always like, well, it doesn't really matter how much money you give. They're going to misspend it. They're going to be corrupt. So it's like a built-in permanent excuse to never spend,
Right.
That's exactly it. Yeah. And the other thing, just one other thing, is that it invites oversight, right? It invites oversight over democracy. So if the politicians are corrupt, who needs to make sure that they don't, and it's often the judges. And so what you end up doing is ushering a sort of judicial dictatorship. I mean, maybe that's too grand a term, but effectively judges come in and be able to say, well, you've been corrupt, right? We're taking you out. And what does that do? Invites lawfare, invites political conflict carried out through the courts. And you can see it with Trumpers chanting lock her up, or with the impeachment of Trump, I think, as well, is in some ways one manifestation of the judicialization of politics.
So since we've been talking about kind of these maybe not perversions, but like manifestations of politics. As you say, post-politics and anti-politics. I realize I should have started by asking you to define politics, or how do you define politics? And then kind of going off of that, something that I think undergirds your work and that of your co-hosts is Peter Mayer's idea of the void. And can you talk a little bit about that in terms of what that means for politics?
Yeah, so politics, as I think I already mentioned, is the basic idea of dissensus, right? Which is the opposite of consensus. It's the idea, it's not just the administration of the affairs of the state on a day-to-day basis or even a long-term basis. Conservatives are always against politics because they want to maintain things as they are. And so that understanding of politics, which is maybe not the common sense one, because I think the common sense one identifies politics narrowly with parliaments, with elections, with administration. Actually, it's something else. It's something deeper than that. It's about dissensus, as I said. And I guess in relation to the void, is that what you have is not just at the kind of level of formal institutions where you have depoliticization, but what you have is a withdrawal. What Peter Mayer calls the void is the space, the huge gap that's opened up between citizens and the state, between the public and politics. And what's happened is that there's been a mutual withdrawal, that elites have withdrawn behind closed doors. And the European Union is a perfect example of behind closed doors politics, where things aren't open to public accountability. There's no minutes are even taken on important meetings, so that's a way of completely avoiding any sort of democratic accountability. But at the same time, us citizens, we've withdrawn. Right? We're no longer members of political parties. We're no longer members of trade unions. We're no longer members even of civic associations, whether it be churches or trade associations or whatever. Right? We just don't gather together in organizations in the way that we used to do. And so what you have is this void where political parties are, in Peter Mayer's terms, cartel parties. Right? And cartel parties means that they have more in common with one another, the political parties, than they do with the people that they're meant to represent. Whether it's their members or their electoral base. And that creates a situation in which these cartel parties owe their allegiance more to the state than to citizens. And so what political parties are meant to be is these organic things where people come together to collectively push forward their interests and their ideals. That no longer is the case, because political parties no longer are able to channel interests from the people up towards the state. Instead, they just kind of belong to the state and float there. And once every 4 or 5 years, they use their political marketing tools to turn to this mass of citizens who they mostly despise and go, hey, actually, would you like to vote for us? Maybe we'll, give you a little something, or, we're better than the other people, or, hey, look, my suit is nicer than the other guy. That's the kind of form of managerial post-politics that ruled the end of history.
But I guess to follow up on that, you had mentioned the movement of the squares. There's Occupy Wall Street, of course, which we, still talk about. And then, of course, more recently, we've seen an explosion of racial justice protests, right? Like here in the US, actually, like all over the world, there's been a kind of outpouring of sustained Black Lives Matter protests. I'm unfortunately being like pretty US centric here, but we've seen lots of mass protests around the world for many different reasons. So I guess the question, this is a big question, and you may not have the exact answer, but like, why can't we bottle up all this energy and like redirect it back into party politics?
Yeah, part of the problem is that the attempt to redirect it into party politics, which was the attempt of left populism, and whether you look at Syriza or Podemos or the Bernie Sanders campaign or Corbyn in the UK, all of these attempts were ways of doing kind of socialist working class politics, but without the working class in large sense, without the masses. And so it confronts the fact of the void, which we've already described, that you're doing, although there was a big influx of new members into the Labour Party, it still didn't really kind of counteract the longer term trends towards the withering away of trade unions, for example, which were the building blocks of the Labour Party. And that's just one example from the UK, but the example, you can take basically the same example across Western Europe, and it's the same sort of story, basically. And so things like Syriza were maybe a more serious attempt to channel all that energy from the squares up through politics. But of course, that ended with the treason of Tsipras when he went against the result of the referendum, when 61% of Greeks voted to reject the memorandum and, as a consequence, probably leave the euro and probably leave the EU. And the political leadership was, in some ways, so distant from the demands, not just of its members, but of the wider Greek people who had voted for it, that he turned his back on it and that, well, no, this is impossible. That's too much rupture. We can't cope with that. And so kind of ran back to the EU with his tail between his legs. So, that presents the problem, not that I'm not suggesting that it's impossible, but that even when those things have been attempted, it's actually ended in not just in failure, but in a defeat, and perhaps ways in which the left was complicit, really, with its own defeat.
Well, on a lighter note, you coined a phrase in the book called Knobs, which is Neoliberal Order Breakdown Syndrome. So can you explain what is that? What is the Neoliberal Order Breakdown Syndrome?
Why are the elites freaking out?
Right. Yeah, well, exactly. That's it. That's basically the question. And anybody living in Anglophone countries especially couldn't help but be struck by the way that elites just went insane after 2016. I mean, just absolutely lost their minds.
Broken brains.
Broken brains.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, people in the US talk about Trump derangement syndrome, and I think we maybe heard of that when we started talking about what ended up being called neoliberal order breakdown syndrome, and we tried to kind of categorize, well, okay, what are the symptoms of neoliberal order breakdown syndrome? Something wider and deeper than just Trump derangement syndrome, not least because it's something that it happens in the UK, but happens beyond that as well. And I mean, the initial thing is just the hysterical reaction to Trump and to Brexit. There was just no good faith attempt to really understand what had happened, why their vision of politics had lost credibility, right? There was no kind of reflexivity there. There's no sense of looking inward and going, okay, well, let's actually examine what happened. So the way we describe neoliberal order breakdown syndrome, or NOBS, is it's the inability of the liberal establishment to accept, explain, and respond to political change. So not just do you have this sort of hysteria, and you can think of, I mean, if you want an image of it, watch Rachel Maddow, right, on NBC, MSNBC. She encapsulates that entirely, where supposedly the people who are meant to be serious and serene and balanced and rational and so on, i.e. kind of mainstream centrist liberals, are the ones who are the most wedded to the craziest conspiracy theories of Russian interference in the most powerful empire that there's ever been, the United States. Russia's manipulating things, right? And that's just that's the most obvious example, but you find it across the board. And you can find it not just in that, but in sort of the unseriousness of politics, of that kind of liberal reaction, and this combined with catastrophism, which suggests that something really bad is going to happen. But, if your response to Trump and the idea that Trump is a fascist, it's something I don't agree with. I don't think he was a fascist. Not to say that there's not a huge bunch of other problems with it, but I just don't think that's the right conception of it. But if your response to fascism is to wear pussy hats, that just seems to me a bit of a contradiction. That doesn't seem very serious to me, and you can see the infantilism of like the giant Trump baby balloon that you had in protests in London and stuff like that. So this infantilism, but there's also a kind of deeper sense of infantilism, which is even worse than just these kind of superficial things, which seem really frivolous. It's the idea that someone else has to come and save us, right? And that is infantile in the sense of looking to a higher authority. So the things that people did, either directly or through the representatives, whether it was voting for Trump or voting for Brexit, where a majority voted for that to leave the EU, to instead look to effectively anti-democratic forces to come and save you. So whether that's suddenly allying with the FBI, like, yeah, those are great guys, to come and investigate Trump, or looking to the judges in the UK to overrule Brexit, appealing to the EU, and so on. Basically, the dependence on anti-democratic or counter-democratic, counter-majoritarian institutions to resolve your politics for you because you've been outflanked or outright defeated.
So if the elites are on the fainting couch, does this present an opportunity for the left?
That's a good question. I'm gonna have to think.
We're also on the fainting couch, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I think the left has its own hysterical reactions, right? And I think a whole section of the left is drawn into the basically liberal orbit. And so, especially without actual left-wing organizations that you can point to, if it's just people online, individuals, and so on, it's difficult to even speak of necessarily of a left in the way that it used to be spoken about, because you could point to trade unions or associations and parties and so on, right? Does it open an opportunity? Yes, but I think one of the ironies, and this is a real unfortunate irony, is that the way that the return of politics has been parlayed into kind of the public sphere has been through the rejuvenation of culture wars. And that's really unfortunate, because it's something that is kind of transversal, cuts across where class polarization should be. So instead of being, broad working class against the middle class and the elite, what you have, and of course that's a bit of a kind of schematic view of politics. It's not always so clear cut, but more or less that, right? Class politics. What you have is something that cuts across, in which where you have sections of the working class, maybe more, let's say, instead of when white majority countries, non-white working class allying with sections of professional middle class people against, on the other side, a whole other section of the working class, and different sections of the middle class, right? So it ends up kind of impeding class politics. And what you've had is a reheated culture wars. And we write a bit about this in the book, that the new culture wars that you have now are different from the culture wars that were typically spoken about that emerged since the 1960s, especially in the US. But you can think about the campus wars in the 80s and 90s as kind of the perfect example. Those were often about moral issues, about abortion, about the death penalty, and so on. And so they didn't seem obviously political. I mean, they're clearly kind of cultural issues, right? Whereas today you have things which seem political, seem quite obvious, about policing, maybe about immigration, even about public spending and things like that, but which should be dealt with in, ideally in class politics, in class terms, in class polarization. What you end up having is something which completely cuts against that, which polarizes people around issues of, as I say, kind of. So anyway, I mean, what I'm trying to get at is that it seems more political than before, right? It seems more political than just culture wars, but it still follows the logic of culture wars, and that's what's unfortunate, and that's what we have to get past. That there's no way of I think trying to pursue that, because it's not even clear what side one should take in that. I mean, I myself find myself completely torn on some of these culture war issues. I'm in favor of a liberal immigration policy, but I'm against the kind of performative claims to having kind of no borders whatsoever, which seems to me a complete kind of neoliberal policy in my view. So
Bernie Sanders has famously called that a Koch brothers proposal, and he's not wrong.
Yeah, and look, I'm in favor of a very liberal immigration policy, but I also recognize it's probably not democratically feasible right now. It's something that needs to be argued for, but it's not something you can just depend on people to vote for. So
So that reminds me, I also wanted to ask you about something we were talking about before you came on, which is this idea of progressive neoliberalism, or some might call it wokeness, which again is this kind of very radical sort of language when it comes to racial and gender issues, and again, borrowing a lot of the language from the New Left and borrowing a lot of that radicalism. But sometimes it seems like that is being used to legitimize, our current economic order. So I'm wondering what you think of this idea. I mean, you've gotten at it a little bit already, but what do you think of this idea of, wokeness on the left and how we should be thinking about it? And also, do you feel like progressive neoliberalism is kind of a last gasp to save our economic order?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think wokeness, which maybe needs to be unpacked, but I'm not going to do that right now. I think we all know what we're talking about, right? It's a certain, hysterical way of doing politics and identity politics and so on. That is clearly being used as a means of legitimation for the neoliberal elite. What I think has happened, and especially after the defeat of left populism, and we dedicate a fair bit of space in the book to talking about the defeat of left populism, again, as I've already discussed, kind of not just Corbyn and Sanders, but Syriza, Podemos, and so on. That defeat has left the left being, in large parts, the last people holding the candle of neoliberalism, because what has happened is that the right, maybe the more traditional right, has been a little bit more flexible, though, actually you could put Biden in this camp as well, in moving towards a more form of state capitalism, for lack of a better way to put it. More state spending. I mean, the UK guaranteed 80% of wages, which is something completely unthinkable, and that's a conservative government doing it. So things are shifting away from neoliberalism, and it's not the left doing it. It's the mainstream right, or even the populist right, doing it. And the reason that they've been led to do it is not just the pandemic, which obviously poses an objective problem which they've had to respond to, but also you've had a decade of populist incursions, just explosions across the West, basically, and that's scared them into doing something. It's not going to be enough. It's not going to be sufficient. But there's more talk now of kind of easing regional inequalities through spending and so on. And so what you've ended up with is the left holding on to neoliberalism. And what I mean by that is, I'm not saying the left is in favor of talking about central bank independence or lowering trade barriers or anything like that in that kind of classical mold of neoliberalism. But it's the last ones holding on to wokeness, which is, in my view, a form of hyper-individualism, and also allied to a form of managerialism, right? That the left's response to, and I mean, I see this in the UK, and I follow British politics more closely than US, so forgive me for talking more about that. But in the UK, you have the Tory government setting the terms of the debate, and the Labour Party and even the left of Labour kind of going, well, we would do that, but we would do that better. We would implement that better. You've implemented that the wrong way, or you're corrupt. Again, return of anti-corruption politics, which leaves you nowhere. It doesn't say that you have a different vision of society. It doesn't really polarize politics, and it doesn't give the left any independence. And independence in the sense of having its own independent politics, which are not parasitic on what elites or conservatives are doing. But what's happened is actually the left ending up really parasitic on that, just saying, yeah, but yes, but, like, okay, yeah, cool that you're doing more spending, but we would do more spending, or we would do it better, or we would implement it in a fairer way, or we would make it more racially equal because there's racial inequalities in the way you're doing it. But that doesn't present not even let alone a systemic alternative, doesn't really present any serious opposition to the way things are now being run.
And you also kind of talk about how the left is trying to kind of circumvent national politics and jump to kind of an international, supranational politics. Can you say a little bit more about how that's playing out? Yeah,
so I mean, this is a kind of form of escapism, I guess, and in a way is the left's own version of knobs, right? That it's affected with a breakdown of neoliberalism, but rather than trying to seize that opportunity, and especially in Europe, I think that can only mean a return to national politics. Not that I think that nationalism is, the kind of horizon of politics, but ultimately, even as an internationalist, you are an internationalist, and that politics has to begin at home. And the attempt to seize the state and to kind of make national politics meaningful again is the only way to move beyond, especially in the European case, the EU's kind of complete crushing of national sovereignty. And I don't mean that the EU is some kind of empire force crushing national sovereignty. The EU is a means by which elites are able to evade national democratic accountability. And for however withered and however much of a void there is in national politics, supranational politics presents even more of a void because it's even more distant from citizens. And national politics, at the end, you still have democratic elections, however, limited, problematic, and so on. They are better, and it's still been the only form through which the left has been able to eke out or gain serious concessions from the elite, whether it be from suffrage all the way up to kind of various social rights, social spending, and so on. And so supranationalism is an evasive thing. It kind of, you see it after defeats very often, where the left kind of goes, shit, all our citizens are against us, right? Or we can't convince people. Because they haven't thought of convincing people. They just think, well, they're all reactionaries, right? They're all either deluded, brainwashed, etc., right? Various ways of kind of, effectively hating the masses or washing one's hands of needing to win people over, to win the masses over, right? And so as a consequence, there's a rush to either to localism, which is its own form of escapism, or upwards, up to supranational politics of trying to carry out politics by creating links internationally, which feels really nice. And it's great to make links internationally with other left-wing people across borders, like nothing against that. But when that takes the place of national politics, which is the kind of the fundamental thing, then that's really a problem, and it ends up being invasive.
You've stumped me. I don't have any. I got other questions, right?
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, and I think you kind of answered it. And when you talk about the left, you say it when you were saying like they're left kind of defending neoliberalism. Is that where you're kind of getting at when I think you have a line in the book where the left as it's currently constituted kind of builds in sympathy for existing institutions? Is that kind of what you're getting at there?
Yeah, and I think there's a thing, I mean, not to reprise what has become a bit of a tired PMC debate, and maybe you've discussed this on this channel before and whatever.
Oh, yeah.
But I mean, in fact, and I don't want to get into it, but but I'm gonna have to get into it a little bit. But effectively, if the left is in large parts middle class today, the problem is that there's a kind of inbuilt sympathy to institutions. So you might hate banks, and you might hate finance, and you might hate industrialists, But you're still sympathetic to other elements of the establishment, which are, I guess, ideology producers, for lack of a better way to put it. I think when you can see a clear example of this, where people, the left, especially the middle class left, overstates the role of the media, which leads them to think that, if you're watching Fox News, you're brainwashed, or Fox News is brainwashing you, for just to take the most kind of obvious example. And that overstates it, because most people don't trust the media. In fact, there's a huge trust deficit. Most people don't trust institutions anymore. Most people don't trust politicians. Politicians are hated. Journalists are hated. Lawyers, even as well, the judicial system. So there's a huge lack of trust, which is, I guess, the substrate or the basis for the anti-politics that we already discussed. But this is in a more maybe sociological sense than just political, that people just don't trust institutions. And it ends up that trust ends up being put in maybe other institutions, but it's never really that strong. So you suddenly see, maybe, depending on what country you're in, police being the only institution that's trusted. Does that mean that people love the police? Probably not. It's just that it ends up being a repository for very limited trust that people have. And that lack of trust is also a product and a contributing factor of the void, right? Of people no longer belonging to mass organizations. And so people are increasingly individualized, increasingly atomized, and therefore mistrust institutions. So where am I going with this? What does this have to do with the left building in kind of dependence on kind of mainstream institutions? Well, it's that the left probably looks at the media, and it might not like many mainstream media outlets, but it thinks people believe in the media. Because middle class people in general tend to believe more in the media, trust the media a lot more. They tend to trust politicians, so they pay attention to all the discourse that happens. But for a lot of people, they're not necessarily paying attention, or at any rate, probably a lot more skeptical of things that come from the dominant institutions in society. And so I think the left has to be careful. We all have to be careful with that, in terms of not kind of substituting in how we feel or how we view the world, and assume that is how all of society views the world.
Mm-hmm.
I think that kind of gets at what we were talking about earlier, where it's like left or liberals left defending universities as this great cultural institution, when increasingly they are alienating people because people can't afford to really get in them.
Yeah.
Right. No, and most people in the US don't have a college education.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's something that you don't even pass through. It's not like, oh, you tried and you were excluded. For you, might not have been even an option, right? I mean, I don't know what the rates are of university participation now in the US, but in the UK, they've made a huge push to get like up to 50% of the population, which is still large, but it's still going to be the upper section of the population. And you have to be honest about that. But unfortunately, the university has become probably the last site of socialization for leftists in society. And as a consequence, and especially because it's not necessarily anything inherently radical about academia. I mean, it's just that you're able to deal with ideas unencumbered with the need for power, but that can lead you to all sorts of crazy places, as
right.
we can see.
So I think we're going to wrap up, but I do have one last question, and it's kind of a big one. But I want to go back to this idea of whether neoliberalism is on its deathbed, right? And again, I think, post 2008 or like post-Occupy, there was sort of a resurgence of optimism from some quarters of the left, where the assumption was neoliberalism is dying and something around the corner is better and is going to replace it. So do you think neoliberalism is dying? And what are some possibilities, both good and bad, for what comes next?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it is dying, but because there isn't an obvious force, an obvious kind of oppositional force within society overtaking it or throwing it out somehow, it's been a slow death. It's been a slow death, and it's been kind of withering away. And of course, the pandemic, which is, of course, an objective force. It's not a subjective force. It's not something that people are consciously doing, banding together to change, to move beyond neoliberalism to something else. It's something that ends up being kind of an imposition on elites, that they have to respond to it somehow. But nevertheless, they are responding. And I think, Biden's spending plans, big numbers, but actually when you factor it out and look at it across a number of years, probably not that much money. But it nevertheless signals a shift materially in terms of the state being willing to spend, and that its proposal to citizens is that we're going to protect you. And I think the whole management of the pandemic, however disastrous it's been across the West, nevertheless, it signals a state like, we're going to protect you at all costs. Maybe we've gone too far in that regard in terms of the lockdowns. But without getting into that debate, what's actually happened is that states are, guaranteeing wages. They're cutting checks to citizens, in the US. And so there seems to be a shift towards a more protective state, I guess, and that elites will now try to legitimize themselves. It might be closing borders to protect you from, the dangerous immigrants out there. But it might take also the form of protecting industries, which maybe were previously threatened. I think it's telling that even someone like Paul Krugman, right, the New York Times columnist and economist, has said that, he really needs Biden's plan to work. And he, asked, aren't you worried about inflation? And he goes, no, actually, I don't care about inflation. I'm not interested in the economics of it. I'm interested in the politics of it. And we can't let the Republicans back in. So Biden just needs to spend to basically win votes. And that prioritization of a political objective, however limited it is, and in defense of the Democrats instead of the Republicans, however limited that is, it's really telling that he's favored a political objective over an economic one, right? And inflation targeting is one of the key indices of neoliberal management, right? Of making sure prices don't increase and making sure that wages are kept suppressed. And I think, just to add one more thing, I think the ideological authority of neoliberals has also ended. So the idea that competition will be the solution to everything, that lowering trade barriers, that reducing capital controls, all these things, no one's making those arguments anymore. If they are, they're the last neoliberals. In fact, they sound a little bit like leftists. They sound a little bit like us. Going, oh no, but that wasn't real socialism. That didn't really work. No, the Soviet Union, no, that was bad.
Yeah,
we're doing real socialism.
This trade wasn't free enough.
Exactly. And that's what they're doing. But you still had way too much state involvement in the economy or whatever. Yeah, but that was really existing neoliberalism. They can't wash their hands of that. They're not allowed to.
Okay, just one last follow-up question. Could something worse come next? Because that's always the fear, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think the pandemic hints at something there where there's a huge increase in state power, in the increase in the surveillance state, that people become accustomed maybe to the idea that the state can tell you, no, you're not allowed out, you're not allowed to protest. We can set the conditions on this. Excuse me. And just a sense that, a sense that the state now is taking care of you. And while that sounds good, I think, relative to the years of neoliberal austerity, when, especially in a place where, like the US, where you have much less funded public services, social services, public spending, and so on, where being taken care of sounds kind of better than being left on your own. But I don't think we should be too happy about that, because ultimately the aim of socialist politics is for us to rule, for us to be in charge, for us to take charge of the future. It is political autonomy, not being taken care of. And so we should be wary of that.
Yeah.
You can have Uncle Joe Stalin or Uncle Joe Biden. That's the choice.
Those are your two choices.
Yeah, that's Joe Brezhnev, I think, as people are saying. Right? Late Soviet America.
All right, so just to remind viewers out there, Alex Hochuli's new book, it's coming out on June 25th, and that is The End of History, Politics in the 21st Century. Alex, do you have any extra plugs you want to make for the podcast or anything we didn't cover in the book?
Well, one plug, bungocast.com if you want to know more information, bungocast.com/book, to get more information on the book. I hope people read it and enjoy it. And you'll also learn a little bit about Italy, because as you see, Berlusconi is on the cover. The podcast is called Alpha Bunga Bunga, right? A reference to the infamous Bunga Bunga parties. And there's something important, because I think if you understand Berlusconi's biography and the history of Italy in over the course of the end of history, you kind of understand the world, because right there encapsulates all the different tendencies. And so if you think Trump was a novelty with his buffoonery, but also neoliberalism, but also populism and authoritarianism, dude, he was late. He came 25 years too late. Berlusconi did all that in the early 90s. So that's a kind of figure that you have to kind of, in some ways, have a grudging admiration for just being the guy who encapsulates the end of history.
Yes, Italy was ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
Again, it's a really great book, so I encourage everybody to check that out when it comes out. We were lucky enough to get a little advance copy, of course, which is why we have Alex on today. But Alex, thank you so much. And like I said, everybody check out the book.
Thank you both. That was a lot of fun. Cheers.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.